All right, welcome back, everyone. We're going to slip right into the next panel, which is titled Identities. And I'll just take this opportunity to introduce the chair of this panel, who is Jeremy Spoon, an assistant professor of anthropology at Portland State University. So I'll hand over the mic to Jeremy.
Thanks, Andrew. This panel entitled Identities. I feel very humbled to be here. I thank everybody for this opportunity. Very excited about the panel we're about to bring forward. We're bringing together different, mostly anthropologists, but others from different disciplines. This panel includes Mahendra Lawati, who is currently, and let me get to my right pages here, I apologize, is a professor of political science at Western Michigan University, followed by Chris Vasant Kumar, who is currently the Luce Junior Professor of Asian Studies and Anthropology at Hamilton College, and finally Jeff Childs, who is at WashU St. Louis and is an associate professor. So we are going to try and keep time as tight as we can so that we can have some discussion as well as the comments from our respondents. So I will now call up Mahendra.
Okay, thank you for the organizers for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. Let me briefly discuss about perhaps what we're asked to do and perhaps what we have not been asked to do with regard to Himalayan identity. Partly because probably political science as a discipline and its research focus probably hinders and obstructs creation of linkages, Himalayan connections, even Himalayan identities, because it focuses on states, domestic politics within states, and so on. So, in that sense, political science as a discipline probably has, contributed to some extent in trying, construction of such a Himalayan identity and so forth. So with that caveat, let me focus on two things. What I will do is I'll briefly speak about the Himalayan identity and perhaps how political scientists oftentimes, not always, but generally, look at those issues and so on. Then I'll talk about identities and how it has emerged in Nepal since it was formed a couple of centuries ago and how it is emerging now in Nepal. So, from a political science perspective, we look at states, relationship between states, domestic politics within states, and of course we also look at people, their mobilization, their attitudes, their behavior, and so on. So from that perspective, when we see identity or we try to look at identity, what we often do is, do the people define themselves as a community? So in that context, do residents of the Himalaya identify themselves as a Himalayan community or Himalayan people and so on? So if we take that framework, probably we have a weaker Himalayan identity in the region, and again partly because, as you saw earlier in the morning with regard to the maps, those beautiful maps and so on, those maps are within those maps we have a lot of state boundaries and so forth. So as a result, because of those state boundaries, the notion of Himalayan identity has been weakened. And even when we look at people within those regions or within those states, oftentimes people mobilize either against the state, or even if not against the state, they often mobilize within the states. Not always, but oftentimes. So in that sense, even when we look at people's mobilizations, people's behavior and so on, many political scientists often do that within those states-centric framework. Not everyone, but to a large extent, that's what people have been doing in the discipline, one could say. So from that perspective, probably, I mean, there is a weaker sense of the self-identified notion of we, the Himalaya people, and so forth. But that doesn't mean that the Himalaya identity doesn't exist. Identity exists as other defined categories as well, because we can, we saw those beautiful maps, and we could definitely say there lies the Himalayas, and there lie many people who reside in those Himalayas, and they have many commonalities, they have many problems, there are many political opportunities, they have contributed significantly, perhaps to better their lives, and we could perhaps learn lessons from them for other regions, other mountainous regions of the world, and so on. So in that sense, I think the Himalayan identity, Himalayan linkages are very important, even though it may not be people-defined, local community-defined identities, and so on. And I think initiatives like the current initiatives, the Yale Himalaya initiatives, and so on, are very important, because I think that is something slightly lacking about the studies about Himalayas and so on. And as we can benefit from it, initiatives such as this, and even the associations, Jeff, and others are involved, the associations of Nepal and Himalayan Studies, who have been trying to foster those kind of linkages. And I just wanted to, share the good news that we did organize 2 conferences, and both the conferences were highly well attended. So in that sense, there is, I think, a market for those kind of initiatives and so on. And the next conference is going to be held at Yale in next year in March, and so forth. So, and those are initiatives taken by people, outside the region, but even within the, the region, like the Ishimote organization, and there are many other organizations that are involved in trying to create such linkages, such identities, and so forth. And even the state-centric, state-centric or state-defined identities, I think if we look at the European Union experience with globalization, with weakening of state borders, and perhaps later on some kind of, some state level organization could weaken the current state boundaries to some extent, and perhaps they could develop emerge a stronger Himalayan identity even in the future within the notion of the state-centric identities as well. So I think there is a need, there is a challenge, and I think we have realized that, and people are working towards it. So probably the states may not be able to hold that need and aspirations behind as well. Now with that, of course, there are, the way we define identities, it could have different consequences. If we look at from the perspective of self-defined community perspective, what that might mean is perhaps because the people themselves as of now, do not or strongly do not define themselves as Himalayan residents or a Himalayan nation or Himalayan people and so on, perhaps large-scale mobilization along that identities may not emerge. That doesn't mean that mobilization at local level within the states and so on have not emerged. They have emerged and they are going on, but at least at the larger Himalayan identity-based framework, probably may not emerge anytime soon. But as I said earlier, that doesn't weaken the need for Himalayan linkages and so forth. Now let me briefly talk about identities within Nepal, because that's what I have been studying and that's where I am from as a native of Nepal. And in Nepal, identity issues have been very interesting in the sense that it began 2.5 centuries ago when Prithviraj Shah, the conqueror, conquered Nepal, and subsequent Saha rulers, Rana rulers, Panchayati rulers, and others tried to create or attempted to construct a more identity based on one religion, one language, one culture, and so on. They tried to declare, attempt to identify Nepal as a Hindu nation, Hill Hindu nation, and so forth. But now, after 1990, that notion of Nepali nation or Nepali identity has been rigorously challenged by Hindus, who were treated as either lower in the hierarchy of Nepali nation, the old Nepali nation, and other Hindus who were horizontally excluded. So we have challenge even from the Hindus of the Madheshi or the Tarai and lower caste, traditionally lower caste Hindus, Dalits, and so on. So the challenge has come from within Hindus as well as non-Hindus like the indigenous peoples, Muslims, and so on. So in that sense, with regard to identity, there is a lot of ferment going on in Nepal. And sometimes that kind of identity politics kind of, raises issues and questions among different kinds of people at the popular level as well as perhaps even at academic level, saying, will this kind of explosion of identities lead to breakdown of the community, of the nation, and including the state, and so on. But what I would like to point out, thank you, in this sense is, if you look at Nepal and if you look at identity politics in Nepal, what we see is at one stage what one can call perhaps the fragmentation of identities. For example, now increasingly people identifying with the linguistics community, the ethnic community, even the caste community, and so on, has been growing since 1990. And for example, just to cite the case of indigenous peoples, in mid-90s or later 90s, around 59 indigenous groups were recognized by the state. But since then, a larger number of groups have demanded that they be also included and incorporated and counted and recognized as separate indigenous groups and so on. So there are now at least government, state, commission, committee identified more than 80 such groups, even though that has not been made public and recognized that report and so forth. But what that shows is some level of fragmentation of identities, if you would. But if you look at within those, politics of identity in Nepal, at the same time and simultaneously as well, what you see is an integration of identities as well. For example, the indigenous nationalities of Nepal, they established Nepal Federation of Indigenous Nationalities in 1990. So they are bringing disparate groups of ethnic groups, linguistics groups from the mountains, from the Tarai, from the hills, and so on, under a banner of indigenous nationalities. And that has similarly occurred with the Madheshi. Madheshi, they speak different languages, they belong to different castes, religious groups, and so on, but the Madheshi are trying to create a notion of a Madheshi nation or Madheshi identity. It is still being contested, but to a large extent, many people residing in the southern plain do agree, do recognize the identity of Madheshi to some extent. And similarly, the same case goes with Dalit. There are many different caste groups, subcaste groups, and so on. Increasingly, they are coming under the umbrella of being a Dalit, and so on. So we have both the tendencies. At one level, many groups of people, many leaders, ethnic elite, and so on, if you would, are trying to assert the different identities, demanding recognition of those identities. But at the same time, the same groups of people are also forming larger categories for whatever reason. We can go into discuss about different reasons, being such as the benefits of electoral politics. If you organize into larger categories, you might be more influential in electoral and mass mobilizational politics, and so forth. So there are, I just wanted to point out because there has been less discussion of that notion, the integrative phenomenon going on in Nepal, along with the fragmentation that many people have recognized and identified and discussed and analyzed. So why have these different identities emerged or are being asserted? Definitely many factors at play. The state has a role, its policies, and of course definitely the people, the concerned people, the elite, and whether the members within those communities accept the leadership and the definition provided by the leaders of those respective communities and so on, and to some extent to the larger society, how it recognizes or refuses to recognize, and sometimes even portrays different identity groups in derogatory manners and so on. So all these factors, and these and many more, sometimes the topographic nature, the territorial, whether the different groups are scattered around the country, or whether they are located within certain territories, whether they speak common languages, or whether even within an ethnic group there are multiple languages and so on. These different factors have facilitated, hindered, and so on in terms of creating these different identities in Nepal. So in that sense, what this probably indicates is that there are a lot of factors influencing how these identities are now being asserted and reasserted and so on. But what we see is, if you look at historically, during the closed polities, during the autocratic regimes and so on, what I call as the attempt to create a mono-ethnic polity was, much more, successful, trying to impose the nation, Nepali nation, by the state, controlled by the dominant group and so on. But with the opening of the polities, whether it was in the 1950s or whether it is after 1990s, what we see is opening of the polities has given much more space to the traditionally marginalized, traditionally excluded groups, and now they have begun to reassert. So now, my own, what I've been arguing is Nepal is probably from a monoethnic state is emerging or moving towards a polyethnic polity. And this issue, at academic level, at least from my perspective, is a positive thing, but it has generated a lot of anxiety within Nepal and so forth. And as a result, due to those anxiety, rightly framed, wrongly framed, or for whatever reasons, has generated its own resistance among the traditionally dominant group, whether they hail from the media, academia, NGOs, bureaucracies, judiciary, political leaderships, and so on. So as a result, there is an ongoing attempt, probably one could say even a backlash against some of these movements, largely in media, largely through bureaucracies, and so forth. But when it comes to, the number game in terms of mobilizing in the streets, or even probably, increasingly through electoral politics also, this larger number of people, the traditionally marginalized groups, though, separate into many, ethnic and caste groups, they are a collective majority, and that seems to be influencing, pushing the polity towards an emergence of a polyethnic polity, what can be deemed as perhaps a multi-nation state of Nepal. So it's a very interesting time in Nepal in terms of identities, and I think we'll continue to hear about these discussions, read about these discussions and analysis and so on. So with that, I think I thank you all for listening to me. Thank you.
So I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of this conference for the invitation and for the fascinating papers presentations we've heard so far. I had sort of pictured a table setting for this presentation, so this is, I think, the first time in many years I don't actually have something visual, my visual crutch to work off of, so we'll see how this goes. So I thought I would start by doing the classically anthropological move of deconstructing some of the key terms in the organizing questions. And then I would talk a little bit about my own research and some of the Himalayan connections I worked on. And so I really want to start by asking a question that I'm still sort of trying to figure out the answers to myself, which has to do with how should one approach area in a world or an academic world that is at least in part post-area, right? And so if we're thinking about, and when Jeff talks I don't want to overgeneralize anthropology because anthropology itself has a complex relationship to area, but the sector of the discipline that I had training in and that I come from, I think, has moved away from an area studies focus. And so the question for me has to do with how can we lay the basis for a new or a renewed approach to studying the Himalayas in a way that doesn't simply make that study another area in a world of areas. And so for me, one way to think about this has to do with opening up the idea of Himalayan connections, opening up the connections for some thinking on that train. And so what I mean is, in the context of my own research, I originally did my work in Amdo, in Gannan Prefecture in Amdo. And I thought I would be working on the connections and interrelationships between different Minzu inside the Chinese nation state. And so I went there and I started to do that work, and of course Tibetans figured prominently therein, but the longer I stayed there, the more and more my own interests and the conversations I was having and the connections I was making got sort of dragged southward. So pretty much the first friends and informants that I made connections with were returnees from India, so folks who had been in Dharamshala or even in Karnataka in South India and had been there for some sort of turned up and immediately hated it or got sick and went back to China or Tibet almost immediately. Other folks had been there for 7 years, 8 years, 9 years. And so I was surprised by that particular trajectory of return migration back to the PRC. And I also got to thinking about the ways in which life in Gannan, 10 years ago now, was lived in a way that was informed by how things were happening elsewhere. So even those folks who had not been to India had friends or family members or had various folks that they knew who had traveled, they had subjective feelings about this, and they had friends who traveled to America. And so I think thinking about the Himalayas as a spatial category or a series of connections, I think we can agree that those sort of actual journeying processes and intellectual and emotional connections that run across the Himalayas to North India are, quite central to an imagining of the Himalayas. Where do the Himalayas begin and end? But the question then becomes, where do we draw the line? What about those folks who have moved from India to Ithaca, New York? What about the presence of Tibetan Buddhist art, and religious iconography in the contemporary centers of Chinese power? Do the Himalayas stretch past the Kumbum Monastery to the Lama Temple in Beijing? And I think people can have different answers to those questions, but I think we need to think about what the rationale for the answers to those questions that you're using. And so for me, it's a question of, do we think of the Himalayas as beginning and ending with the physicality of the mountains? And do we sort of root our scholarly intellectual practices and journeys there, or do we associate it with a broader set of connections that are both geographical and also affective? And in that case, is this meeting itself somehow part of a larger conceptual entity that we would think of as being the Himalayas? And so, as I said, I don't really want to force an answer to that. But I do think if we are reconceptualizing the Himalayas as, okay, on the one hand, certainly there's a physicality and a groundedness of actual geographic space. But on the other hand, if we are thinking about the itineraries of human movement and the connections of human feeling that stretch across and beyond those mountains, it pushes me to a point where I question whether the old guarantees of area give us sort of how should I put this? If we're thinking about traditional area studies, the notion of area itself is a guarantee that at a conference like this, everybody is talking about the same thing. If we're at a South Asian Studies conference, regardless of whether you are a philologist or a sociologist or a demographer or an anthropologist, what have you, everybody's talking about the same thing because we have that guarantee of area. And my concern is if we are to further the study of the Himalayas, can we approach this in a way that doesn't have that guarantee that we're all talking about the same thing? How do we know that we all, are we all in the right place? Maybe, maybe not. So the question then becomes, if we don't have the guarantee of the physical geography of the mountains in a particular space on the map, how then do we understand certain kinds of places and cultural concepts and human journeys as hanging together? How do these things come together and form this thing that we would call the Himalayas? And so I would say, and again, feel free to disagree, that there is something useful in keeping that an open question as opposed to allowing it to be resolved by the fact of the Himalayas. So that's my deconstruction of Himalayas. How much time do I have?
About 12 minutes.
Okay. So the way that I want to sort of put this into practice a little bit is to say a little bit about the final question in the sort of set of questions that Sara and Andrew put before us. So particularly, how does transnational mobility in the past and present challenge understandings of ethnic and national identity as commonly defined? And so I want to answer this question in a context where you should know a few things about me. So I started out as a Himalayanist. I can remember starting my graduate school career and sitting through classes on the anthropology of the Himalayas and looking at various ways of thinking about, okay, the relationship between altitude and peoples and the conceptualization of the Himalayas as the interface and various other modes of mapping something called Himalayan identity. At a certain point, I stopped being a Himalayanist and I went on a detour through China anthropology. And so my view of this is from the north slope, which is a much more gradual and imperceptible slope than the south slope. And so in this context, let's see. In this context, the kind of movements that I'm talking about are centered slightly differently than the most common kinds of mobilities that are discussed. And so I'm thinking particularly of the sort of return migration of Tibetan returnees from India and back to China. I'm thinking about that kind of mobility in the context both of other kinds of Tibetan mobilities and movements in the Himalayas more generally, and also other kinds of Chinese mobilities or even sort of mobilities that are shaped by larger global processes. But so I will talk about sort of a typology about those movements in a little bit. But let's a couple points about how transnational mobility has affected ethnic and national identity in the Himalayan region. So the first point is I think we have to approach this question thinking about transnationalism not simply in spatial terms or in political terms, but in temporal terms. So if we look at the patterns of human movement and migration in this area, we can see that mobility of various kinds both precedes the formation of national communities and has outlasted certain kinds of national communities. So we have to think about the degree to which it's not a simple case of the nation state preceding the transnational community, which then moves across its boundaries, but that certain kinds of mobilities exist in a context of shifting political forms that then often reshape those mobilities to their own particular purposes. And so one of the places we see that is the efforts of the contemporary Chinese state to reshape journeys of Tibetan return as the journey of an overseas Chinese person returned to participate in the modernization of the homeland. So there's not a necessary relationship between the nation state and the transnational here. Okay, that's number one. Number two, I think we have to look at the ways in which trans-Himalayan migrations have been productive of nationalist sentiment. So again, this is going against the common sense mapping of, okay, you have a nation state, and we know how people feel about nation states, and we know how nation states are bounded, and once you have those boundaries and those feelings, then communities can proceed out of those and miss them or relate to them in particular ways. But if we look at the dynamics of the Tibetan situation and even of the prehistory of the Chinese nation state, we can see a situation where you have movement itself as a key moment in the production of ideas of a shared community. So George Dreyfus and Kaplan and other folks have talked about the moment of exile itself as playing a crucial role in the formation of a unified notion of Tibetan nationalism. And so there's a situation here where we don't simply have pre-given categories that movement across boundaries then reshapes. We have the categories that come to have a certain kind of stability themselves emerging from certain kinds of movement. That's number two. Number three, looking at the relationship between trans-Himalayan migration and nationalism, I think we need to question a natural relationship, or how should I say this? We need to de-link the idea of the nation from the usual form of its territorial expression that we find it in. So we think about the territorial nation state, a nation that has its own, the classic Benedict Anderson or Tongchai. Where do you find the nation? You find it in a body on a map that's defined by a line around it. If you look at the Tibetan situation, that is one of the possible nationalist alternatives that's emerged since 1959. Alongside that, you have a kind of national imagining that's linked not to territories on the map, but that is linked to the body of the Dalai Lama himself, or linked to a particular corpus of sacred and religious, or sacred and traditional culture. And so in that version of nationalism doesn't necessarily stay put. Where do you find the true Tibet? You could find it inside the TAR in the territory of Tibet. You could also find it in northern India or southern India, or places where you have access to these kinds of traditional culture. So again, there's an uncertain relationship between mobility, the nation and the nation state. Okay. So the point there is that notions of nation themselves are traveling. And so when you look at the sort of intellectual and cultural cross-pollination that's occurred with the movement of young Tibetans to and from India, and the conversations they've had about traditional culture and its uses, and nationalism and its potentials, and bringing those ideas back with them to the place where they started their movement, the categories themselves are getting scrambled. So you can't predictably find, or you can't predict easily what sort of nationalism a person living in one particular place will espouse. Okay, so it looks like I'm... so what does this mean for an emergent focus on the Himalayas? Well, I think it has a couple possible implications. The first implication is that if the lives that these individuals lead between China and India, or between the West and Tibet, at various locations in these larger networks, are informed by significant elsewheres, I think we need to take into account the connections and travels of ideas of Himalayanness and Tibetanness and even nationalism. And I would suggest that as we go forward with this, it's worth thinking about articulating a notion of the Himalayas in which movement is at the center, and in which if the consensus is that an area study is what we want, that area is outward looking, is looking as much for areas of possible comparison with other kinds of border crossing regions, or is looking for is keeping in mind the far-reaching connections that go beyond the mountains, right? So everybody in these mountain valleys is watching television, or not everybody, but many are on the internet, are using this technology, or traveling. And so how do we combine a focus on the travels of the Himalayas with the groundedness of the Himalayas, right? And so trying to come up with some idea where we don't simply drift off and everything is in motion, and hey, there's a Tanka on that wall, that must be the Himalayas, but we have a kind of attention to the form as a kind of grounded multiplicity that has to be investigated, as opposed to having the crutch of the area to fall back and help us explain it. So I think I'll end with that. Thank you.
Well, while that's warming up, I can preface this with a caveat. I'm totally unqualified to speak about identity for the simple reason that I never considered it to be a topic that I wanted to investigate. As a graduate student in anthropology 20 years ago, it was the big rage, and being a contrarian, I decided I'd study something else. But Sara and Andy asked me to fill in on this panel and switch from another, so I decided I'll take a hit for the sake of the team, and let's see what happens. My already tattered reputation might be sunk today. Nevertheless, I do a lot of demographic research, and so I think that I can address at least one of these questions. How does transnational mobility in the past and present challenge understandings of ethnic and national identity as commonly defined? But like everybody else, I'm going to change the question. I'm just going to be a little bit more blatant about it. And here's the question that I'll change it to. How does mobility in the present challenge understandings of ethnic identity among Nepal's Buddhist Highlanders? So with that in mind, I want to talk here about identity. It's been studied in reference to both Tibetan exiles of South Asia and Tibetanids, borrowing Charles Ramble's term, which didn't really take off too well, but he coined it. Okay, borrowed it and perpetuated it. But for a long time, these groups have been treated analytically separately in the study of Tibetan identity, and I'll argue here that that's really no longer feasible for reasons that will hopefully become apparent. So in the 1990s, two of this workshop's participants, Tsering Shakya and Charles Ramble, wrote seminal articles on Tibetan identity. Tsering argued that in a historical times, regional identities amongst Tibetan were far stronger than any national identity. And so you can still see that a strong sense of place is still very evident. A decade ago, I was doing a study on Kirong historical demography, and I'd run across elderly people and try to find the next person, and they'd say, oh, well, go talk to Mogul Dorje from Mogul Village, or go talk to Lente Pema from Lente Valley. This sense of my identity is connected to a place was very strong, and of course they were all Kirongba first and foremost, Tibetans second. But as Tsering pointed out, Tibetans are culturally unified through a common faith, Buddhism, and with the fall of Lhasa and the flight of Tibetans to Nepal and India, it did bring a new sense of unity for Tibetan exiles to a certain extent, if not to Tibetans as a whole. And after that, scholars have devoted a lot of time to studying Tibetan identity in exile, finding that all sorts of strategies were used to form a pan-Tibetan identity, which, according to Tsering, has been founded more on anti-Chinese ideology than on faith. So in contrast, the ethnically Tibetan border dwellers of Nepal have retained their own distinct identities, or at least until recently. And with respect to those labeled Bhotia, Charles Ramble wrote in 1997, there is at present no organization in Nepal claiming to represent the Bhotias as a single ethnic group, nor indeed, I believe, is there any sentiment among the peoples in question that they constitute a distinguishable ethnic category. Now, that might be changing with modern ethnic politics in Nepal. Up in Nupri, where I work, I came across this sign. I don't know if you can see it, the Himalayan Autonomous State. When I quizzed locals, what's that all about? They said, I don't know, it's about a guy with a can of spray paint who put it up there. They really don't know what it's all about. But in addition, Charles noted that some groups have distanced themselves from the term Bhotia, the term that's applied to them in the Nepalese state, and evidence for that is still found. If you look at Nepal's census from about a decade ago, I went into the Nupri Tsum areas and just took the upper VDCs, and everybody claims Gurung ethnicity, yet they speak Gurung, Sherpa, and Tamang, which is perhaps a little bit of a disconnect. And I did the same with Upper Mustang, the upper VDCs of Mustang, and you find very few Tibetans, a lot of Gurungs, some Lepchas, all in Low Mentang, and they all speak Sherpa and Lepcha. So a lot of people would easily dismiss this data as useless, but to the contrary, I don't. I think it's very interesting because it opens up all sorts of questions about why people self-identify in a certain way. And so I asked my friends in Nupri, what do you tell the census takers? And they said, well, we did that because we don't want to be labeled Bhotia. We don't want to be put on the lower rungs of society. So I asked them the same questions. Well, how would you self-identify? I would ask them, what is your ethnicity, Metik and Tibetan? They say, well, we're Tibetans. What language do you speak? We're Tibetans. So given that, they do have a close identification with Tibetans. So why haven't we seen some convergence across the northern Himalayas of identity? So Charles, referring back to his article again, he felt that it was a combination of linguistic differences, cultural differences, geographic barriers, limited economic exchanges going kind of across the Himalayas, a lot going up and down, but not across with these valleys. And that was basically preempting the formation of a pan-Tibetan identity amongst these communities. And he argued that the potential unity provided by Buddhism as a rallying point, and quoting him, was opposed by a close attachment to a limited territory that found expression in cults of local gods. And certainly there's a lot of truth to that, because where I work in Nupri, Gangpung Yen, Mount Monaslo, is a real organizing point for people's identity. They think of themselves as their Yula, their protective deity. They have rituals dedicated to it, and so on and so forth. So Charles was definitely right on course there, but things have changed, and I think the questions we have to ask now are changed because all of these barriers are diminishing and being removed. And how so? Well, first of all, let me just point out that we've seen it happen amongst Tibetan exiles, so it's good to reflect upon those processes. The regional differences do remain somewhat important, but mainly amongst two groups. The elderly who were born in Tibet and the newer arrivals who were also born in Tibet but have come out more recently. But when I was doing research amongst the exiles, and a lot of other people found this, those who are raised in the secular school system de-emphasize their regional identities. They socialize with kids from all over the Tibetan plateau, and they intermarry, and they're not, these regional differences aren't as important. So when we think about the school as a site of enculturation, we can see that it has effectively reduced, although not eliminated, the barriers that regional identities pose to the formation of a broader Tibetan identity. So is something similar happening in Nepal today? The answer to that, I've been gathering demographic data in these areas for a while, and last summer I'm on a really interesting project, and we can talk about, how do I find my identity as an anthropologist. Working with a physical anthropologist is a great way because we get back to our Boasian roots of, de-emphasizing the differences between the subdisciplines and coming together on common projects. But Cynthia Bell at Case Western and I and Sienna Craig have a project going together on genetic adaptation to high altitude and its impact on fertility. So I'm the resident demographer on this particular project, and I run the Nupri Tsum part, and Sienna runs the Mustang part. So we've been able to get a lot of good demographic data, and just talking about Nupri and Tsum, these contiguous valleys, our geographic coverage is all the villages of 10,000 feet and above. That was because of the hypothesis we're testing about altitude, but it's a good sample size. We got 500 households, detailed demographic data on these, and here's what emerges. If you're not familiar with population pyramids, you can see males and females are divided here by color on the axis, and age groups on the far left there. So you can see there's roughly 150 males aged 0 to 4, and slightly less than that females. This is a way of visually seeing what the population looks like. And as a demographer, I can say something about it. This is the de jure population, people who are born in the area and have rights to reside. The first thing I can say is it has the characteristics of a young and growing population, which raises the possibility that we're still looking at an area of the world of high fertility. And indeed, when you see that large cohort of kids, you see that, and then I haven't done full fertility analysis yet, but just the completed fertility of women in the 40 to 49-year-old cohort, they were having a lot of kids. Okay, so things change now when we disaggregate the population. What I'm going to do here is show that same population, but I'm going to disaggregate it into the light color is those who no longer reside there. They're born there, they don't reside there. The dark is the de facto population, those who are actually in residence. This tells us a completely different picture about what's happening in these communities. And to give you an idea, these are the percentages by age group and sex who are out of the village, who are no longer resident. They're basically being sent away to schools and monasteries as far away as South India. And if you take a look at the 10 to 14 and 15 to 19-year-old cohorts, a very small, a minority are actually being raised in those villages. The vast majority are being sent out, and this has to have some implications for identity, because if place is so closely linked to identity, how will outmigration shape identity formation? The idea that we're going to look at identity and see to it, I don't think it applies anymore. I mean, I think we got to get away from that, kind of going with what Chris was saying. Now, as a special treat for you people today, I'm going to show you the Mustang data, which is so hot off of my Excel spreadsheet that it's burning a hole in my computer. We've just gotten the data cleaned up to a point where Cynthia sent it off to me, and I hurriedly put this together to show you. There is our age-sex composition, and once again, what are we seeing? Huge chunks of the population are pretty much being removed from that population, especially in the younger age cohort. So again, this is going to have an enormous impact on identity issues. Just to kind of compare the two, we see there's some similarities. I think the fertility transition in Nupri and Sum is just starting. Whereas it's been underway for at least 15 years in Mustang. Out-migration of youths from Nupri and Sum, whereas with the Mustang case, we've got substantial households, entire households moving out as well, and the destinations are further away and more diverse in the Mustang case and the Nupri case. But, again, I don't want to just say this is only happening in Nupri. I think we can see this all across the Himalayas, and the more data that we have to show that, the better nuance we can get about it. So in any event, I want to switch a little bit now and kind of make it a little bit more personal. Here's Dawa, a kid from Nupri that back in 1997 I raised money to get him a scholarship to go to school in Kathmandu. So I was a catalyst for out-migration, I guess. So the first schools I approached were these ones run by the Tibetan government in exile, and at first they were like, oh great, we'll take him, you got a foreign sponsorship? Yeah, great. And then I said, and he's from Nupri. They said, well, we can't take him, he's not Tibetan. Okay, well, I did find him a place in a school that was a private school run by Tibetan refugees as well. And as a matter of fact, most of the schools in Kathmandu that cater to Tibetans are run by Tibetan refugees. So he did get a place in it, but what's very interesting is that these schools are teaching a lot about Buddhism. They're also teaching these kids who are not from Tibet about the Tibetans' political struggle against China. This is another site of enculturation for kids who are not born in Tibet. So as Dao grew up, he became increasingly interested in Buddhism. He started taking meditation classes, and in 2008, when all the riots broke out across Tibet, he started posting on his Facebook page all these support the Tibetan cause type of messages, which is really interesting. And Tao is not alone. There's been a rapid fertility decline amongst Tibetan exiles. They're not putting a lot of kids into the schools, and also a lot of migrating out. So nowadays, without these kids from the highlands filling these Tibetan schools, those schools would close down. They don't have the population to sustain it. They're drawing them from the highlands. And as a matter of fact, from our survey, we can see that 27% of all the kids currently in school are in these particular schools, and that's just from one or from two little valleys. So what we find then is that they're learning new values. They're learning new values about what it is to be a Tibetan, not just a Nupri person. They're also thrown in with people from Dolpo, from Mustang, from Walungchung, from all these areas. And these are kids. We have to remember that these are kids. They're not terribly concerned about, oh, you're from Dolpo, I don't want to know you. They're trying to make social relationships, and they're breaking down the barriers of regionality as they're doing it. And so last summer, some of our research assistants were from Tsum, some from Nupri, and it was very interesting to see how they can naturally interact with each other, speaking Nepali. Their regional dialects are different enough that they communicate in Nepali. But also one of my research assistants, she's from Tsum, her husband's from Walungchung. The sister of another one, she's from Nupri, her husband's a Sherpa. So regional endogamy is really breaking down as a guiding principle in marital decision making, and that's going to affect identity. Okay, but this doesn't mean that people's identities are being completely decoupled from their places of origin. And to quote Charles again, sorry Charles, I'm really highlighting you here, but you get to speak later today as well. All sacred geography involves doing violence to nature by reorganizing it in ways that are congenial to human terms of reference. And in the traditional Tibetan perspective, wild territories are tamed by Buddhist practitioners, and they're made into places that are suitable for habitation. And I think that's a useful starting point to see how the processes by which these youths who are removed from the rural environments from a young age and raised in urban boarding schools, how they're envisioning their continuing connection with what has now become a foreign and perhaps even a wild landscape, the places where they were born. When you see these youths going back home for visits, they're clearly uncomfortable in these landscapes. They complain about being bored, how dirty everything is, how difficult it is to relate to uneducated villagers. They regularly deploy the term backwards to describe their villages. And yet back in Kathmandu, they're creating a different narrative by idealizing their homelands. It's very interesting what's going on there now. So young people from Tsum, for example, now are at the forefront of labeling their homeland as the hidden valley of happiness, the Bayu Kimalung. And this is from their Facebook page, when it's Tsum Valley Facebook page. And so, you know, on the about it says Bayu Kimalung, the valley of happiness. Well, what is this Bayu Kimalung? David was talking about Shangri-La before. Well, let's reintroduce that. Sonam Lama is a guy I know quite well from Tsum. He wrote in the Nepali Times very recently, if there's a Shangri-La in Nepal, this is it. The Guru Rinpoche is said to have meditated here. Tsum is one of the sacred hidden valleys of the Himalaya called Bayu, a place of such tranquility, and you can read on there. But I found this very fascinating to see this happening, and it's also been picked up, not surprisingly, in the tourist literature. The bearded vagabond refers to trekking in the Valley of Happiness, that is Kimalung. But I used to be well versed in the hidden land literature, and I even started working in Nupri because it is the locale of the hidden land, and I was intrigued by that. So the last couple of years as I witnessed this new connection of Kimalung with Tsum, not Nupri, I couldn't help but note that Tsum is rarely, if ever, mentioned in the hidden land literature. When I challenged my young Tsumpa friends, including Sonam, to find some references to Tsum in this literature, well, they often don't read Tibetan, but they always assure me, my cousin's a monk, I'll get him on the case and we'll find it. Yet I haven't seen the evidence yet. But whether Kimalung is situated in Tsum or Nupri is not really the issue here. And let me just kind of run you through here, because I didn't show this before, but here are the valleys. We'll put in Nupri and Tsum there. There is actually a Kimalung circuit. It's a pilgrimage route that's not used very often, but it does encompass Tsum and Nupri. But the actual hidden land with its temple is situated right there in Nupri. It's very clear. But so successful have they been at creating this image of Tsum equals Kimalung, they're claiming that's what Kimalung is. When I just did a Google search, which is not a great metric here, but when I put in Nupri and Hidden Valley, I get 420 results. When I put Sum and Hidden Valley in, I get 19,200 results. They've done a good job. So in any event, I think that it's interesting because, again, it's not where the place is located that's interesting from the perspective of identity. I think what's very interesting here is that for the Sum youths, coming from a hidden valley of happiness provides these kids with some connection to a homeland that, besides being kind of a rough and tumble place on the outside, is actually a very special place. And so they're taming the landscape framed as backward in the discourse of development by drawing upon this Buddhist utopian vision, and in doing so they're presenting it as a place whose inhabitants are the epitome of the Tibetan exceptionalism that they've been learning in these schools, that they're innately spiritual, nonviolent, conscientious stewards of a pristine environment. It's precisely that image that they're learning in school and that's been promoted by Tibetan exiles. So they may not want to live in Sum, but going back to Charles' terms, at the very least they want to present their homeland in ways that are congenial to human terms of reference. Okay, I'm going to run out of time very quickly, so I have to dash ahead. But I did want to say something about kiduks, these welfare associations, which are forming right, left, and center. Traditionally, this was a way for people to defray costs of funerals and weddings, are very expensive, so you get a grouping of families together that help each other out. And they would have even white registers. I mean, it's a great example of balanced reciprocity. Whatever another family gives you, you record that. When they have a wedding, you have to give exactly back what they gave to you. But the evolution of this that we're seeing through time is that there used to be village-based associations. As Tibetans moved from the highlands into Kathmandu, we saw some spring up, and now they're becoming international associations. So it went from being like Sherpa Association of Nepal and the Nupri Association, which still is based in Kathmandu, to now we've got the Walloon Community of North America, United Sherpa Association, Dolpo Society, all international societies. And note how they're all referring their identity, they're pegging it to Buddhism. But again, these are very regional things. And as Charles wrote again about when he was first noticing these, their concerns were regional. But now as they branch out into international communities, I just want to look at the Yolmo Kiduk very quickly here to see what they say on their website. First of all, the main objectives is to establish a strong support system. When you look at that, you can refer to Massey's theory of cumulative causation, how some people will form a bridgehead and that reduces the cost for other migrants from that place to come and settle in this area, this particular part of New York. But also, they are doing some identity maintenance to preserve and promote Yolmo culture. They're fulfilling some of the traditional Kiduk functions. But here's another interesting point. It looks like they want to link up with like-minded organizations. What are those? Those are other Kiduks from the Himalayas. And so we can see perhaps the formation or the nascent formation of a pan-Tibetan identity here. You look at the Mustang Kiduk in the USA. Well, not too long ago, they had their stand in solidarity with Tibet Day. Kiduk looking at a broader Tibetan issue. Also, this one, I don't think it went very far, but you did have Hipa.com, so Tibetan.com, which was comprised of, if you look at the members and executive board, it's all these regional kiduks that were coming together to promote a common cause. And by the way, website powered by freetibet.us. Okay, so what does this all mean? I'm not entirely sure. Again, this is not my real topic, but a couple points I want to make here. Number one, with respect to questions of identity, I think we have to focus on the youths and the educated youths. These are going to be the real drivers of identity issues as we move into the future. They're mobile, but also they're communicating across communities. They have friends from all these different communities. They're going to be the real drivers of the identity formation. Second of all, we have to move beyond our superficial statements like people are more mobile today, and actually start to get a quantitative sense of what's going on. I mean, this is a huge depopulation issue we're looking at that is going to impact everything from environmental sustainability to household economic practices to labor allocation within the household. So we can no longer look at identities in a general Himalayan way like they're done in development discourse a lot as these are rural poor farmers. We can't look at them that way anymore. That's not what they are. There's the movement to the Gulf. They're wage laborers. They're making their money off of Yartsagumbu. In Tibet, 75% of their household wages come from non-farm labor. So we can't look at them as poor rural subsistence farmers. And also, just one last point about our genetic research. What if our genetic research actually says these people are gurungs? What do we do then with identity?
Well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you especially our panelists for 3 very serious papers that are intellectually provocative and methodologically important. I just want to remind us, I think we should start by saying, what did they say? Well, Mahendra Lavoti reminded us that a political science view of identity sees both fragmentation and integration happening. And he also reminded us that that looks at this within the context of a state. And temporally, he's reminding us that in Nepal, this process is changing very fast. And then when we look at Chris's paper, he's focusing on this word of mobility, transmobility, and asking us where the area is when we want to do area studies. How do we do area studies when it's centered on movement and on connectivity, and the word you use, trajectories, the word in the title of this conference, itineraries. And then we just heard Jeff's tour de force, where he manages to get statistics even into a discussion of identity. And very well too, that we need to look at the ground reality of what are the shapers, what are the actual constituents, the actual human bodies on the ground that actually are the sources, the forces, and the holding containers of identity, if I can put it like that. He didn't shake his head, so I will put it like that. I think some general questions can come out of this. I think looking overall, not specifically here, at a general tension between the social scientist's view of the subject and the view of, let's say, other, not just disciplines, other approaches of the subject, the philologists, the cultural studies, the religious studies, the Tibetologists. We're looking at the general tension in all our discussions here between the view of the subject as special and the view of the subject as ordinary. Is our study there to find commensurable similarities between people, in a sense, as multiple variants, what Jeffrey Samuel earlier referred to as, should we be looking at people in their commonalities with the peoples in sub-Saharan Africa? Or that other view that Jeffrey talked about, the idea of these people as part of a culture that's of exceptional interest to those of us who study it. So, revisiting there what Jeffrey brought to us this morning, I think we have to try to keep this in mind. We're not in a position to rule out either option. Here, where we see these 3 important papers that focus on the subject in terms of commonalities with other kinds of subject, other peoples who move, who migrate, who live in places, who leave their elderly behind, who seek for cash income, and so on. There's a certain, it's hugely important that we do that, but the risk is a kind of reductionism. And as we all know from many years of critique, the risk of the opposite approach is a kind of exceptionalism. So between these two, we have to find some kind of productive interaction between these two views. We also have to find a productive interaction between this very problematic question of the outside and the inside, if I can put it like that. And here I'm thinking about the marginal and the center, I suppose. When we think of the larger Himalayan area, whatever we mean by that, and as you've heard already, we tend to be focusing on Tibet, Nepal, sometimes Bhutan. We're looking only at a fragment. But even within that fragment, we tend to focus on the area around the mountain, the southern mountain fringe of this larger area. If we remember what Peter Perdue said this morning, that we can think of Xining in some way as the northern extremity of this area, we tend to look more at this southern area, the area around the mountains, where we do see these processes of fragmentation that all our three panelists spoke about so eloquently, this process of movement, and particularly transnational movement. In fact, we have at least two of my exceptional students here who are exactly from the places that Jeff has been talking about, who know about it in much more detail in their lived bodies even than Jeff can explain to us. But in fact, if we think just about that population, millions of those people are living in the northern parts of the Tibetan Plateau, or the eastern parts of the Tibetan Plateau particularly, actually closer to Xining probably, closer to where Chris did his research in Ganam. And what we find it difficult somehow to introduce those people into the same conversation. This is the historic problem of, shall we say, Nepali studies trying to talk to, shall we call it loosely, Tibetan studies as it evolved after 1980s. This is partly to do with access, where we, if we can call ourselves a collective, where we get permission to go and research. It's a strange thing because many scholars are Chinese. Here, of course, we mainly have Li Bo, but he can go to any of these places. Any Chinese scholar can go to any of these places. But we tend to be giving preference to English and Western languages, mostly English language. We tend not to be reading the literature of our Chinese counterparts and collaborators who we heard a lot about earlier, who are talking about the peoples in theirs. How can we create a more inclusive discussion that goes across this area, rather than the areas where we, because of our linguistic preferences and habits and historic dominations, in the case of English, have access to. And again, are we somehow distorting or giving a special preference to the mobility factor that goes towards the west or towards the south, where we have that access? We meet these people all the time because of the particular subgroup we are, because we're not scholars in China, for example, or in Pakistan or Bangladesh. How can we extend that thinking to think about people who we don't meet, who go in other directions? The mobility, for example, to Lanzhou, or to Chengdu, or to Beijing, or to Guangzhou or Hainan. This may be important. And maybe if we ask that question, I'm not sure necessarily that mobility will be the issue. And I'm also not sure, as I think several of you mentioned, Chris in particular, that it's not necessarily a new issue. It's a prehistory. We know that these areas are marked as being between major centralizing states, historically, over thousands of years, trading routes and so on. So there's a certain need to think in the long term about these mobility questions, and to think of what isn't about mobility and what isn't about coming towards the areas which we, in our particular group, have preference for. Thank you.
Jeff, aside from whether you give PowerPoint masterclasses, I'm intrigued by the idea that bote can gain attraction now in this more connected and international climate of dispersal that it never had within the nation state itself. But the Indian government, and this is a question to colleagues from India, classifies people who are Tibetoid across the Himalayan region, East and West Himalayas, as bote or bhutia. So
Bo's shaking his hand. But the Indian linguistic census that I have access to says the people along the top northwestern fringe and the northeastern fringe are all Bhutia. So does that state classification of these very distinct communities somehow create a wider sense of Bhutianness or not? And it's really an open question.
I could respond to the, it's complicated, of course. The ethnonyms are used differently. That may be a linguistic classification, and it's certainly a popular word. It's not used by the Indian government in classifying people, say, in the census or in terms of ethnicity. A lot of activists down in Dehradun, places like that, will resist the term, or when you get up into the Bhutia valleys, it's not such a big deal. Internally, they use the names of the 5 so-called mahals, and so there are, Marcha, Tolcha, Darnia, etc. So it's pretty complicated, but it's not, it may be in some places a linguistic term, but actually, because of the activists, I think it's a term that the government would avoid.
Thank you. Oh, please, Jeff.
Just very, very briefly, I don't think that any identity is going to coalesce around the term Bote. You notice from that website they were calling it Viva.com. And so I think that it might coalesce around something that would be called generally Tibetan, but certainly not Bote.
But that's because it's an image.
Tibetan. So what is Tibetan?
Pardon me?
The global name for Tibet is what?
The Nepali and Indian names, not the Tibetan name. The Tibetan name is Viva.
The reason
And
the reason I should add that the so-called Bhutia is one of the main reasons that these Indian groups don't sometimes resist the name is they do not want to be identified as Tibetans or Buddhists, because they're very much trying to assimilate into mainstream Hindu Bahari society. So that's really what lies behind that.
Thank you. Please.
There's a question.
Yeah. Question. Who's got that? Right over here.
There's a couple things that, if we're deconstructing categories as well, things like migration, right? And migration can take so many different forms. These kids that are in school, how many weeks of the year do you have to be in a place to have it be an important part of your, sort of your habitus, your experience of when you go out and when you come back, as opposed to when you go out and stay out. And increasingly a lot of these migrants they're part of the family is back and part of the family is out, and so you put up a bunch of those Facebook images, but the number of them that are miss you, love you, see you soon, all these very, very poignant expressions of separation, so that some of the ideas about what migration means, and again, the question of where you're talking from. If you were talking from Western China to Eastern China, maybe nobody would call you a migrant any more than if you move from Boston to California. Well, maybe not Boston to California, but somewhere else, right? So the questions of what migration means, and sort of somehow seeing if we would learn something more informative if we thought about what the different kinds of migration would be. And it's obviously the same question about identity. There's the kind of politically deployable group identity that is so visible on the Nepalese scene these days. And then there are other things about what you call yourself. And I think things that you found with calling yourself Gurum but speaking Tamang, and I think Mark found those things in Sikkim as well. Instead of trying to erase the confusingness in that, maybe enjoying it a little bit more, maybe exploring it a little bit more, so that you find out that, nobody will call themselves Bote, even though that may be a really salient identity figuration for who you rescue and who you don't rescue, and who you despise and who you don't despise, and so on. So I just, each of those terms, I think actually, I think deconstructing them at this point a lot more would be a very interesting project. And I wonder things like in your migration literature, how seasonal is it? How permanent is it? How, right? And some of these identity politician leaders, how has their self-representation of identity changed? I was just trying to look on the NEFN webpage to see. At one point they did have Bote listed as, but it was only one or two little areas, and it wasn't clear how they identified it. But I'm not sure exactly what the question there is, except to say, maybe respond in terms of how useful is it to think about identity as more than one thing and migration as more than one thing?
Before our panelists respond, we're going to take some more questions, please. Maybe raise your hand. There you go.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of echo what Catherine was saying. I loved your paper, Jeff, and what I liked about it was you called into question a lot of easy assumptions. And you took one easy assumption after another and you tried to question it. That was all good. But then you made an assumption, I think, which I would like to question. You said several times, in light of this migration, you kept saying, look, with all of this migration, identity must really be changing. And I wonder, of course, well, yes, I guess it must. But the fact that someone may be going to school far away or spend years separated from his or her native place doesn't necessarily, it may result in a strengthening of local identity. And it seemed to me that the point you were making was that local identity may somehow be weakened. Not necessarily. It could work the other way around.
Let's take another question. Over here, please.
I got a question for Geoff Child. And it's very interesting for you to talk about Gitu. In Tibetan it means shared happiness and bitterness together. People are very serious in joining the Gitu organization. It's a very traditional because it's organized on the principle of career, your gender, and also your hobby and something else. And according to your study, are there some new function of the transnational Sherpa Gitu? You just mentioned about some Sherpa Gitu in United States. Do they have some new function, like economical and social and cultural? Thank you.
Thanks, Nimatashi. We had a question over here, too. Yep.
I was wondering to what degree it would be helpful to think about other mountainous areas that historically were sending huge numbers of poor migrants out. The Alpine region, also split into many different nation-state units. There's a whole history there that might be enlightening, and it's always seemed to me that being away from a stigmatized place makes you prouder of it than you were when you were there. So Appalachians out of Appalachia are likely to be more proud of Appalachia, as are Irish out of Ireland proud of being Irish. So there's something about distance from a stigmatized identity. To take up the question of Appalachia just ever so briefly, it's astounding the degree to which, let's say in the Civil War, since the people highest up in the Appalachians didn't have slaves, they also deserted at much higher rates than any other parts of the Confederacy. And in fact, you can correlate altitude with desertion almost perfectly. We have the statistics for that. And these places in the hills had more in common with one another in many respects, ecologically, in terms of trade, in terms of subsistence modes, in terms of illegal distilling and so on, than they had with people in the valleys, right? Through all of these different states. And I thought that most of these people, of course, left Appalachia, just as there were, I think, was it Detroit or Cleveland was the second largest Polish city after Warsaw. So was Detroit essentially an Appalachian city for a long time. And yet, they took along their bluegrass music, they took along parts of their cuisine, and so on. So they became a kind of diasporic. It seems to me that Appalachian identity has been formed more in the diaspora than it has been formed in Appalachia itself. But the general point I wanted to make is that it would help us to look at other sophisticated, deep analytical histories of other poor mountain areas that are export labor in order to at least sensitize us to some useful questions with respect to the Himalayas.
Let's give our panelists a chance to respond. Please.
I guess a lot of those were directed at me, but let me just start by saying, Catherine, I agree, but in a 20-minute format, I couldn't break down migration into temporary, semi-permanent, seasonal, and so forth. All those categories matter. I agree completely. So in future work, I will refer to that. Bo, you're right. I'm guilty of an assumption. I will restate that as a hypothesis that's worthy of investigation. Yeah, you're right. I think that's an assumption that I'm making. It might be right, it might be wrong, but I don't know. I haven't actually investigated this, so I will restate that as a hypothesis. According to Kiduks, yes, they are serving new functions abroad, and again, that's why I refer to Massey's cumulative causation model of migration, because I think it is a facilitator of further migration by connecting the people in the homeland with a potential migration destination, and that is not a traditional cubic function. And your comment, I'm already doing the literature review on the Alps. Viazzo and Bob Netting, who is one of my heroes in anthropology, have written about these. Japan's mountain areas have depopulated. It's interesting to hear the Appalachian case. I'll look into that as well, because this is not a unique phenomenon. Every mountain area in the world in an area that has become rapidly developed has depopulated very rapidly as well. So that's all I'll say.
And I'd just like to, two microphones, respond a little bit further to Catherine, because I think it's a very good suggestion to specify different sorts of migration, but I think we also have to put migration alongside other kinds of movement, and think about what kinds of movement we want to include in Himalayan connections. And so the one that has been occurring to me is what do we make of sort of the massive growth of Chinese backpacker tourism to Amdo, and also to other parts of the PRC, and also even to places like Nepal. And is that something that is do we conceptualize that as inside or outside, or some sort of complex mixture thereof?
Let's take a few more questions, please. Jane, over there. Dan. Oh, sorry, Robert. Go ahead, Robert. Please. Yeah.
Yes.
We can hear you.
Yes, thank you. Throughout the whole panel, I've been thinking of one person whose autobiographical works I've read, a fellow named Tenzin Repa, who was born in Mukinat in 1646, and his life story brings up many of the issues that all three of you have spoken about. He was a Repa, cotton-clad yogin by profession, you might say, but he came about it through great difficulty. He had two trips to central Tibet. One was forced because he went up over onto the top of the plateau, hooked up with some central Tibetan yogins, but then was kidnapped by them, taken eastward, sold to a Nepalese merchant coming back on from Lhasa, and was taken to Kathmandu, and then escaped, spent a couple of years in and around the greater Kathmandu Valley, and back up to Dolpo, and then went over to Dingri. And he thought, well, here I'm going to find a community a like-minded community. And he hated it there. And he ended up going with an Indian yogin to Lhasa, because the Indian yogin was the only person he said he could get along with at Dingri. And when he finally got to central Tibet, he absolutely hated that place too. And he spends a lot of poetic ink talking about how institutionally corrupt central Tibet is in the late 17th century. He finally goes back to Dolpo, which is where he made a retreat center, so a successful retreat center. And he reflects on whether he's Tibetan or not. And he's very explicit about this. Am I a lowlander or am I a Tibetan? But what he seems to wrap his identity around the most is landscape. Right? He's not so concerned about institutions, he's not so concerned about social groups, he's concerned about landscape. And so what he ends up writing most of his poetic output and autobiographical output is about landscape. So what I liked about what you did collectively, unintentionally even, was start to differentiate the different types of criteria that are going to go into making an identity. What I take from Tenzin Repa is that you can be profoundly dissettled and have great disagreements with one's own social identity and regional identity.
Thank you. We have time for one last question over here. Andrew? Yep.
Well, thank you very much. You know, there was a question in the Indian Parliament about 6-7 years back on the status of the Tibetans in India, Tibetan refugees in India. The question was related to the numbers first. The second was a very specific questions whether the Tibetans have been given the Indian citizenship or not, refugees. And the Indian Home Minister made a statement, twofold statement. There are more than 100,000 Tibetan refugees in India. And second was, though some of them have been offered citizenship, they would not like to take citizenship. But he made a supplementary statement saying that, but on top, though they have not been able, they are not willing to take citizenship. Government of India is extending all the facilities, including education, health, and all. Now, this is despite the fact, the minister also said this is despite the fact that India has not ratified the 1951 conventions and the 1967 protocol on the refugee management. Now, if you see in Nepal, and the Mark made a statement about Bhutias and Tibetans. In India, Bhutias would not like to be Tibetans, and Tibetans would not like to be Bhutias. Because let's be very clear about it. In Bhutias, Bhutias are a very clearly scheduled tribe. They have got a clearly scheduled tribe status in India, right? That means they are Indian citizens. That too, they have a very specific character. That's why they are scheduled tribes. So they get other facilities other than the normal Indian citizens, right? Whereas in case of Nepal, the refugee literature, wherever it has been written, not very clear about. On the one hand, they have not signed, Nepal has not ratified both the 51 Convention and the 67 Protocol. On the other hand, they allow the refugees to come in and settle there, but also at the same time would not extend any rights that is generally extended to a common citizen. Right? So the presentation today actually raises whole range of questions about what are their rights, even as simple what you call refugees, right, besides their identity.
Thank you for that comment. I'm sure we could keep this discussion going for a while. Let's take it to the break for the next 15 minutes in the lobby. Thank you very much for a wonderful session.